Good afternoon and welcome to chapter 15 of this set of videos on the history of the BBC. And you can see I have a new ident behind me, the children's BBC ident from the early 90s, I think. And I also have my BBC t-shirt, because I always think you can't really teach well with it if you don't have the proper t-shirt. In this chapter, I'm going to go on to further into the 1980s and see how far we get, looking at certain key events, certain key programs. Now this is the timeline part of the set of videos. The set of videos began with general questions of what questions need to be asked about the history of the BBC. And then it followed on with a presentation of the Director Generals, who had a lot of influence over what happens, and a section on the commissions of inquiry, which were set up by the government to decide, yes, should we keep on paying for the BBC? Should we abolish it or whatever? Should we change it or what should we do? Now, I've tried to introduce, as I go along, a certain amount of social and political context, because, of course, what the BBC does, it's such a massive institution, is deeply influenced by what's going on in society, what the big conflicts are. But no doubt you need much more input on that, which I can't give here. So where were we when I last started? I think I finished the last video talking about vetting. So I will go on to the next thing. So as we move into the 80s, I wanted to show you a little bit of statistics about radio, and obviously every key episode or key fact that I show you tends to link in with one of these big themes, the BBC and diversity, the BBC and modernity, the BBC and government, the BBC and democracy, the BBC and populism, the BBC, etc. And this one is particularly interesting. I thought this is the budget and the percent of listeners for the BBC's main radio channels in 1983 to 4, although I'm sure it was the same the few years before and the few years after, and the actual precise date is not so important. And you can see here you have the annual budget, which is £13 million for Radio 1, today's pop music, £28 million for Radio 2, the popular music of the last 50 years, £28 million for Radio 3, classical music, and £39 million for Radio 4, intelligent talk, theatre, documentaries, culture, and so on. And so you can see that the budgets are quite different. And in particular, if you look at the line below, you see the listening percentage of each radio channel, and Radio 1 got 28% of the listeners, and Radio 2 got 22% of the BBC listeners, I'm assuming. No, they don't. Oh, no, of the total. This is of the total listeners, so the commercial radio had some, which you can't see here. Radio 3, 2%, and Radio 4, 13%. And so here you can see a very particular idea of what public service radio should be doing, because the management of the BBC, and no doubt the government, because this went on year after year without any objection coming up, thought that if 2% of the national audience was listening to Radio 3 classical music, then they should pay, this was worth the BBC spending £28 million a year on it, twice as much as the Radio 1 budget, 13 million, a bit more than twice as much, which gathered together 28% of listeners. So this is obviously, certainly could be seen as very much elitist. It's considered that public money should go much more to classical music than the others. So this is right back in John Rees, well, what's superior, what's inferior, and so on and so forth is still very present. So I thought that was interesting, because we occasionally get the impression that elitism at the BBC was something that happened in the 20s and 30s and maybe in the 50s. Absolutely not. It's something which is generally permanent and sometimes openly defended, saying, well, yes, elitism is good, but quite often just silently elitist. Now, this is not to damn the BBC, because it certainly could be argued that presenting classical music to everybody is a worthwhile use of public money, certainly. But what is interesting is this huge difference, which is never discussed. This is automatically taken for granted by all BBC managements, that much more money should be available for classical music. Now, as the 80s go on, we have the arrival of a couple of new things on the BBC and a couple of big events. I'll come to this slide in a moment. But in 1983, you get the first national breakfast television service, and the BBC manages to launch it on the 17th of January, 13 days before the commercial television launch. So it's sort of a bit of a coup there for the BBC. And it's the following year, then, that the miners' strike comes to dominate the headlines. The miners' strike, I think at the beginning of the miners' strike, there were 180,000 miners on strike. And by the end, probably over 100,000 even at the end, but a certain number had gone back to work. This was a major political battle. One of Margaret Thatcher's main priorities was to reduce the power of trade unions, the influence of trade unions, and the miners were the strongest trade union in Britain. So the strike went on. The strike was about closing down mines. The government decided to close down mines, and the people would lose their jobs. But it seems fairly clear that the real object was to destroy the miners' union, because the miners' union was the most powerful. Now, to cut a long story short, spoiler alert, Margaret Thatcher won, and the trade union movement was demoralised for at least 20 years. So this is an interesting political point. It was extremely expensive for the Thatcher government to win the miners' strike. Hundreds of thousands of hours of overtime for the police. They had to import coal from Poland, which is obviously extremely expensive because it's a long way away. But the government were prepared to pay it because this was a political battle, and they knew that they could weaken the trade unions for a significant period of time. And indeed, after the miners' strike, they were able to bring in a whole series of laws very much restricting the influence and capacity of trade unions to take action. And there was some fight, but not much, because the general attitude in the trade union movement was, if the miners lost, we can't possibly win. Where does the BBC come in here? Well, of course, the BBC became very important because people wanted to know every day. And as a general rule, I don't think one could really dispute that the BBC was against the strike. In particular, you have the importance of agenda setting here, because when the news began every night, for a whole year, what was the most important piece of news to concentrate on? So it's not that the BBC necessarily frequently invented things against the miners. I'm sure that they didn't generally invent stuff against the mining, but the news bulletin tended to open every night. How many miners went back to work today? How many miners abandoned the strike today? And so this was put forward as the most important question every day. And so this is obviously very much a priority of the government. Sometimes there was severe fighting between large groups of miners and large groups of police. And in particular, in what is known as the Battle of Orgreave. Orgreave was a steelworks which the miners wanted to close down because it would help them win the strike, and the police were keeping it open, and there was an enormous amount of violence. I mean, obviously, from the point of view of the battle on the ground, the police won because they had far better weapons and so on. But this news article, which I put on the slide, which came out many years later, when they opened up the BBC archives about the strike, and they showed that the BBC were worried about a particular news bulletin where they believed that they had not been neutral. And in fact, what they were accused of doing was showing the events of the day in a different order, and fundamentally showing them the miners attacking when in fact they were counter-attacking after the police had attacked them. But this is a whole huge question about the coverage of industrial disputes on the television and on the BBC, because the point is not so much, the question is not so much whether the BBC is producing propaganda or lying. In general, it's much more about the BBC, and I've already mentioned this, and the BBC setting the agenda and saying, these are the important questions, and here are some questions we're not going to talk about. because that's how the media work. 1985, to get back to questions which were more internal to the BBC, 1985 was a great year for the BBC. First of all, there was a big political event, and secondly, there was a big television event. So first of all, the political event is that the Peacock Committee was established by Margaret Thatcher, and it reported the following year. Margaret Thatcher herself was in favour of stopping the licence fee and having the BBC open up to advertising, which corresponded with her general Thatcherite priorities. And the Peacock Committee was widely expected to be a battleground between Margaret Thatcher's ideas and established ideas of public service broadcasting. Because notice, of course, the government could not just do what it wanted. There was a wide variety of opinions inside the Conservative Party, many of them wanting to defend the BBC as high quality level of broadcasting of culture, for example. And the Peacock Committee decided that the BBC should not carry advertising. And interestingly enough, in the report, they used arguments which would more persuade Conservatives. So, for example, they were saying, oh, well, commercial television will get less money if there is more channels competing for money for the advertisers. In any case, the Peacock Commission recommended the privatization of radios 1 and 2, suggesting that any private company could do that work. But this did not happen. And this is a very, very interesting moment, that not only did Margaret Thatcher want the BBC to take up advertising and, possibly move towards privatization in a few years, and the Peacock Committee said, oh, well, let's privatize part of it, but none of this happened. It appeared that it was somehow considered to be politically impossible because of the reputation and the popularity of the BBC. The other huge event in February 1985 was the arrival of Eastenders, and this is a tremendously important moment. So Eastenders, a soap opera which still continues today, from 85 till today. Now, one of the difficulties that the BBC had is that the soap opera was very much dominated by commercial TV, and I think defenders of commercial TV could easily argue that commercial TV has done soap operas better than the BBC, although the BBC did have soap operas from early on the radio. Mrs. Dale's Diary is often considered to be a soap opera, and The Archers on the radio was a long-standing soap opera from the beginning of the 50s. But on television, the great, hugely popular soap opera was the commercial TV one, Coronation Street, which was the life of many people in an imaginary street in Manchester. And perhaps you remember that the key characteristics of soap opera are, one, many characters, no main hero, and two, many plot lines, many stories happening at the same time. Number three, which applies mostly to British soap operas and not to some American ones like Dallas and Dynasty, is that British television has specialized in soap operas about ordinary people. Now, soap opera was originally the term was originally invented as a mocking term, as a negative term about this kind of program. But today it's just become, we call them soap operas, but it's not considered to be a negative thing. So after 25 years of Coronation Street started in 60 or 61, I can't quite remember. After 25 years, the BBC finally dared to put forward competition. Coronation Street was in Manchester. They were going to make this one in London. And they were going to follow much of the same codes as Coronation Street, but perhaps with some more modern elements. And Eastenders would be very important in that they would be showing more black people, more later on homosexual characters, and much later on transsexual characters, but that's after our period. And of course these dogs here. And so they put a lot of effort into launching Eastenders. They had a huge advertising campaign in the United States about Eastenders is coming. And they were and it could easily have been a failure. If it had been a failure, they would have closed it down after a couple of years or after 1 year, and commercial TV would have been laughing at them for decades. Interestingly enough, it's a little later that there's a number of EastEnders episodes which are quite controversial, but one of them in the 90s was the portrayal on drama on television of the first gay kiss, and this was tremendously well put together in the sense that one of the characters was gay, but he arrived on the street, and for 6 months he was just one of the characters doing things, and nobody on the street knew he was gay, and nobody in the audience, the audience didn't know he was gay. And it was so this was very realistic in a way, because many people were, in the 80s, were still being secret about being gay. And so this gentleman was presented as a sympathetic, nice guy, and then people discovered he was gay. And I occasionally say that I think that perhaps this gay character in EastEnders, because soap opera's about people like us, our friends and neighbours, and people feel very close to the characters in soap operas, and so I sometimes say that this character may have changed more in people's ideas about gay people than 100 documentaries on BBC at 11 o'clock at night. Ooh. Now the different series of documentary series, the different documentary series which the BBC were managing to produce, often in collaboration with an American company, and gaining a very high reputation, and each time getting millions of viewers. I've already mentioned several of them. A new one came out in 1985. This is The Triumph of the West. Now, if you look at the title, The Triumph of the West, it sounds like it might be rather triumphalist or imperialist or colonialist, and in fact not at all, although it's certainly not, it's in no way a radical tract. Nevertheless, you can see, because I've put the titles of some of the episodes there for you, that it is certainly not a very one-sided view of history. So episode 1 was The Benefits and the Costs of Western Influence. Episode 10 looks at India before, during, and after colonial domination. And episode 13 looked at third world countries learn the price of dependency on the West. So it's certainly not a triumphalist set of episodes, and it was recognized as a quality product. It was sometimes controversial, and this is the sort of series that makes conservatives accuse the BBC of being too left-wing. In 1985 was also I've got them in the wrong order, but in 1985 was also a moment which was important in the history of BBC and women, because Monica Sims, and you can see her here, produced a special report at the request of BBC management entitled Women in BBC Management. And it was revealed that the number of women in top jobs, well, I'll give you the numbers, there were 159 men in senior management. So how many women do you think there were in senior management in 1985? Notice this is after the big movements for women's liberation. There were six women, 159 men. What was new, however, in the 1980s is that this was beginning to be recognized as a problem by the BBC. So the BBC was certainly not in the avant-garde here at all. And the Monica Sims report concluded with 19 recommendations, including more career guidance for women, an examination of policy and appointments, and an increase in the number of women attending management training courses, and also the introduction of some women-only management training courses. So this was quite shocking, I think, in the 1980s. And sometime in the 1990s, things began to very seriously change. Now, the women who did survive in important jobs or in high-up jobs in the BBC very often had to be very resourceful and be prepared to move sideways, move from department to department, because it was often impossible to move up one department because of the attitude of top By 1970, sorry, I don't have the numbers there. Now the trade union, the ACTT trade union report on discrimination had pushed for radical demands, such as employer funding for workplace creches, so that there would be a place for women to leave young children, since it was generally accepted that women would be responsible for them. But all this moved forward very, very slowly. Another of these wonderful documentary series in 1986 was the Monocle Mutineer. And this one might be considered a little surprising, because it's the story of the life of an officer, a British officer during the First World War, who deserted and helped organise a mutiny. Now, there were not a lot of mutinies in the British Army during the First World War. There were more in the French Army. But it was perhaps quite surprising to see the BBC putting forward this this story, and certainly they were much criticised for being too left-wing in this aspect. Now, I missed out. For some reason, I put the slides in the slightly wrong order, because I wanted to talk about Marmaduke Hussey, because when the new Conservative government was elected in 1979, many people in the BBC thought this is going to be hard times for the BBC, because it was well known that Margaret Thatcher thought that the BBC should introduce advertising and not spend so much public money, and also it very quickly became two or three moments of conflict with the Thatcher government, for example, over the coverage of the Falklands War in 1982, 81-82, not quite sure which, and the Margaret Thatcher found that the coverage was, in inverted commas, not patriotic enough. So there was lots of points of conflict, and they were quite right at the BBC to think that this was going to cause trouble, and in fact the Thatcher government waited until the death of Stuart Young, the chairman of the BBC, died, and they appointed in his place Marmaduke Hussey, who was close to the Conservative Party. And he was seen a little bit of as Thatcher's hatchet man, and indeed within 3 months they forced the Governor-General Alistair Milne to resign. And this was considered to be quite a shocking episode, because literally Alistair Milne was called into the office and said, "You're sacked, you must leave this morning." And so he understandably felt that he'd been extremely badly treated, and there are interviews of him using not very polite language about the management. And certainly Margaret Thatcher, but perhaps even more one of her ministers, Norman Tebbit, had a very strong idea that the BBC was against the Thatcher government. Thatcher later said, "I have fought 3 elections against the BBC, and I don't want to fight another against it." And so this is quite well known that Margaret Thatcher felt that the BBC was against her. Although certainly from the point of view, the BBC had plenty of reasons to be sceptical about Thatcher's priorities, because privatization was very much in the air. Nevertheless, it's mostly let's say, a point of view that cannot really be backed up. There's no sense. The idea that the BBC was against the government policy in the Thatcher, in the Falklands War, or against government policy in the Miners' Strike, it's just simply not true. So although Margaret Thatcher wanted them to be much more pro-government, I think it's false to say that the BBC was against the Thatcher government. They were just not perhaps as pliable as she would have liked them to be. Right, so another, again, we're still here on the documentary series, which are one of the best examples if you want to defend the BBC as a producer of quality programs. And here is one of them, which was called The Africans of Triple Heritage. It was jointly produced by the BBC and PBS in the United States in association with the Nigerian Television Authority. And it was shown on the BBC in 1986. And so this is an African scholar who presents this series. And certainly, although, as somebody pointed out to me recently, the BBC never made a documentary series about the collapse of the British Empire, Nevertheless, a documentary series like this, and part of the BBC's job, it's true, is to create and is to help build a national narrative, and that is to say, a national narrative of the elite. Nevertheless, there are quality documentaries like this one, which certainly do not show a colonialist point of view. In fact, it's vaguely third worldist in orientation. So it was, in fact, at the beginning of 1987 that Alistair Milne was suddenly told to resign or be sacked. And the new Director General, Michael Checkland, came in, and his job was to very much to reduce spending and to sell things off. So the BBC photographic collection, which, as you can imagine, was huge, was sold to a private company, and it is now owned by Getty Images. And during the 1990s, this process continued with the separation of certain whole operational arms and separated off into separate companies, still owned by the BBC, but ready to be privatized at a later date, probably. As we move into the 90s, one of the important novelties is not quite a novelty because there were them in the past, but certainly in the 90s, there was a real rise of what has come to be known as the lifestyle program, cooking programs, gardening programs, do-it-yourself programs, and quite often well done. And here is an example, Master Chef, which lasted from 1990 to 2001, which was a cooking competition. And those of you who know British television today know that the Great British Bake Off is massively popular for a cake-making show. But it just goes to show. Now, this interests me, the lifestyle. I don't know if it's really the right term. That's the term that journalists tend to use, lifestyle programs, in a slightly negative, skeptical tone, I think. But it's turned out that one of the things that the BBC can do, and sometimes commercial television too, is intervene in different aspects of people's lives, and for example, encouraging people to experiment with food. Now this is interesting because we remember that the BBC said from the beginning, we want to inform, educate and entertain, but as I've often said, that's what the BBC management thought. The audience do not come home from work in the evening and say, oh, well, I was informed yesterday and I was educated on Wednesday, so I better get entertained today. In fact, television programs can do much more than that for people. Sometimes people watch television programs to relax, and sometimes they're useful to them in their everyday lives, and cooking programs are an example. And here's another one, Ready, Steady, Cook, from 1994 to 2010. So again, I'm mostly showing you programs which lasted a long time. This one lasted for 16 years. This again was a competition, a cooking competition. The last cooking show I want to show you started in 1995, so right at the end of our period. Can't Cook, Won't Cook. And Can't Cook, Won't Cook, the principle of it is that they were asked the audience to nominate people they knew who either were very bad at cooking or refused to cook. And they brought into the studio, with the help of a celebrity chef, and here's one of them. He's one of the celebrity chefs, I'm pretty sure. And they did a cooking competition between them. And this could be very funny, of course, because sometimes it was quite disastrous, but quite often they produced some quite impressive things. So here we have a number of different things. First of all, we have the fact that enriching people's capacity to cook, including the audience, is considered to be one of the roles of public service broadcasting. And perhaps you remember that the Annan report said, inform, educate, entertain. That's very good, but maybe we should have a fourth one. Enrich people's lives and open up new possibilities to them. And this is a very, very interesting aspect of the BBC. And certainly if you think of sports programs, I think I already mentioned that the sports program Grandstand, a very long program on a Saturday, First, they concentrated on very, very popular sports, football and cricket, and gradually they introduced more and more coverage of minority sports. And the number of different sports which are practiced in Britain went up tremendously. And so this is an idea that, public service, one of public service roles should be to enrich public life in this way. And I think this is very interesting. It's not directly political, although it might be considered to be part of a rise in in the democratic spirit. Just one more example of a lifestyle program, Gardener's World, then about gardening, 1968 until 2020. So again, impressively long-lasting. Other things that were going on in the late 1980s and the early 1990s were a new kind of sitcom. Red Dwarf is a British science fiction comedy franchise which began in 1988 and continued until 1999. Tremendously funny. I think Ben Elton was involved in writing some of it. I'm not absolutely sure. I know that Grant Naylor was involved, which is actually two people with one name. And the story of this was that they're in a spaceship, and one of them is in a stasis, in hibernation, and he intends to be in hibernation for a couple of months. But in fact, there's a terrible explosion, radioactive, and so the ship computer leaves him until there's no more radiation danger, which is like millions of years or something. And so when he wakes up, there is no other human being in the entire universe. They're extremely funny. So yeah, the sitcoms. At the end of in 1988 to 95, then certainly the Thatcher government and then the Major government from 1990. So again, a Conservative government, were getting increasingly involved in the BBC leadership. It was considered that the nominations to BBC governors were more and more political, whereas, as you saw with the different commissions of inquiries, there was often an attempt by the different governments, Conservative and Labour, to have a little balance. To have some balance and not appear as simply appointing commissions of inquiries which were hatchet men for the government. Well, certainly under Margaret Thatcher and John Major, this was they were much bolder about politically intervening in the BBC leadership. Notice not intervening directly in the programmes, but intervening in choosing the people who are going to be choosing. And for example, in 1988, a government proposal on legislation stated, as viewers exercise greater choice, there is no longer the same need for quality service to be prescribed by legislation. It should be for the operators to decide what to show and when to show it. So this was the idea that the charter of the BBC and this great public mission of public service was no longer so necessary, because there was going to be more and more cable, more and more satellites, and so the BBC's role. This is what the Conservative government thought. The BBC's role was going to gradually reduce. Well, this is probably true. It probably has reduced. I think, when you've got Netflix and cable TV and all sorts of other television channels, it's no doubt true that the role of the BBC has been reduced. But nevertheless, even today, I think the BBC is tremendously important in British culture. To go back to the 1990s, in 1991, for example, BBC World, so the channel of the BBC that broadcast outside the UK began to sell advertising time just in the same way as any commercial broadcaster would. Now, what else do I have to say to finish on the 1990s? Well, there is the 1990 Broadcasting Act, which is a law of the British Parliament, and the aim of the act was to liberalise and to deregulate the British broadcasting industry by promoting competition. And this led to the abolition of the Independent Broadcasting Authority, which was the government body which controlled commercial television, which fixed the framework of commercial television. This act allowed for the creation of a fifth terrestrial television channel in the UK, Channel 5, and it also allowed the growth of multi-channel satellite television. This act from 1990 followed the recommendations of the Peacock Committee and said the BBC must buy at least 25% of its output from private production companies. So that was the Broadcasting Act 1990, which also had an effect on radio. It allowed for the launch of 3 private national radio stations, and also many more local and regional commercial radio stations. Now, the Conservative government said this Broadcasting Act allows a massive expansion in choice, whereas though many defenders of the BBC said it's a massive reduction in quality. This act had a tendency to polarize opinion very strongly. So I've almost finished. I just want to look at the end of my notes. Well, 1991 was the war in the first Gulf War, to get the term right, so again the BBC was involved in tremendous in tremendous controversy about how much it was becoming a propaganda channel during the war. A final program I want to mention from 1990 to 1995, well, there was a well-known sitcom, which I do recommend, it's quite funny, called Keeping Up Appearances. And the central character is an eccentric and snobbish lower middle-class social climber. It's all about this woman who wants to be of high social standing and tries very, very hard, much too hard, and we all laugh at her. Now, what's fascinating about this is that it seems to be one of the favourite subjects of British sitcoms, social standing and class. And so whether it is Steptoe and Son, whether it is The Good Life, a 1980s sitcom about managers giving up the rat race of commercial jobs and instead growing their own foods and keeping their own goats, but in a bourgeois part of town. There are a whole series of, and even Till Death Do Us Part was very much about class. So it seems it may be a national obsession. It certainly seems to be an obsession of the of British sitcoms. John Burt became director in 1992. I've already spoken about him in the videos on the Director Generals, and that's the end of my notes. And indeed, I'm pretty sure that is my last video on the timeline of the BBC. There may be more videos about particular aspects of studying the BBC, historiography, for example. I haven't yet decided. I know that a number of you who are listening, if you're listening in 2021, the first time these were put out, I know that a number of you have, in exactly 1 week's time, important exams which may be about the BBC. So I'd wish you good luck with that. And others of you I know have exams in March or in June about the BBC, so I will probably be back with more on that. But for the moment, this is the end of the series of videos on the timeline of the BBC from 1992 to 1995. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now.